Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Canedo Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Sandra Tomc of the University of British Columbia presents a talk entitled Vampires Revealed, Dressing the Gothic in Vampire Films.
And we're live.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the final episode of Spooky Evenings 2021. And we have the great Dr. Sandra Tomc with me tonight. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me. Thank you for organizing this fantastic event. I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking today from the unsurrendered traditional territories of the Musqueam people here in Vancouver and at UBC, and we are committed to realizing that acknowledgement is an active dedication to more just and more accountable relations. And with that, I'll start my talk, and I'm going to share screen.
Please do. Your talk entitled "Vampires Revealed."
Yes, yeah,
the
that's
Gothic.
the title. That's the title slide. So they'll be. Here we go. So hopefully this will work. Play from start. Okay, just a second here. There, can you see that all right?
You're good.
Okay, excellent. In his introduction to the book called Vampire Film, Undead Cinema, Jeffrey Weinstock isolates three main properties of the vampire in vampire films that stretch across all instances of this timelessly popular genre. Number one, he says, the cinematic vampire is always about sex. Quote, vampires are undisciplined forces of desire that exist outside of social networks and outside of socialization. Theirs are bodies that spread out, transform, and envelop. Driven by their sexualized thirst, they absorb and devour the life force of their partners. Vampires are pure id, end quote. Number two, the vampire is always more interesting than those who pursue it. For They Know Not What They Do, Slavoj Žižek writes, quote, the paradox of the vampire is that precisely as living dead, they are far more alive than us. mortified by the symbolic network. The real living dead are we, common mortals, condemned to vegetate in the symbolic. And 3, this is his third characteristic, the vampire always returns, by which Weinstock means that every vampire belongs to its own cultural moment, brewed in the peculiarities of whatever time period or social world produced it. At the same time, the vampire is invariably treated as something expelled from this social and cultural world that produced it, something unincorporable and disowned. Often, scholars agree, a distillation of gendered and racialized phobias. In other words, the vampire is always alien to whatever world it seems to occupy. Thus, one characteristic of vampire movies is an unusual emphasis on geographic and often transnational mobility, the vampire being a force that invades from abroad. The vampire is a force of movement and change and a constant state of disintegration and renewal. Okay, so we have here 3 main properties of the vampire. 1, it is an undisciplined force of desire, pure id. 2, it is the site of a mysterious vitality, a jouissance that makes its audience into the dead ones. And 3, it is a site of endless mobility, exterior to the culture, moving in vast shadowy realms that cannot be confined in time or history. But the question I want to ask today is, why is the vampire always dressed the same? The vampire is associated with all of these wild, erratic, otherworldly forces and energies, but the clothes that the vampire wears are almost always the same. In fact, vampires seem to be locked into some kind of repetition compulsion. So why is this? So the vampire since the 1920s, I'm just going to show some slides here of vampire clothing. The vampire since the 1920s has been typified by a black coat or coat, and often this black item has a scarlet lining. This costume seems to have originated in the flamboyant cape sported by the 1920s stage Dracula, played by Raymond Huntley. And this is Huntley here. It was subsequently popularized by the Bela Lugosi Dracula in Todd Browning's 1931 film, Dracula. So here's Bela Lugosi. There's another Bela Lugosi. These black capes and coats were then subsequently replicated in vampire films to a degree that is actually quite astonishing. So here we have Christopher Lee in this cape. Here's William Marshall in this same cape. Here's Jack Palance in a variation of the cape. Frank Langella, also in the cape. Wesley Snipes, also in the cape. Kate Beckinsale, a little bit different, but not that much. James Marsders, who played Spike on Buffy. And then Twilight, you think, oh, that must be an exception, but even Twilight has the Volturi Coven, and most recently, Klaus Bang in the BBC production of Dracula. This is also now the standard costume sold for Halloween and costume parties. So I just got this off the internet. This is a quite elaborate Halloween costume that follows this rule absolutely. It is also historically a staple of vampire parodies. So this is the Munsters, and there's Al Lewis as Grandpa, sort of Count Dracula figure. And here is Laszlo in What We Do in the Shadows. And in fact, the black cape is such a reliable touchstone that it makes itself felt when it doesn't appear. So you're conscious of the black cape not being there in a movie like Twilight, for example. It's also the case that even vampires who don't wear the black cape are nevertheless distinguished by their clothes and hair. Catherine Deneuve, who plays Miriam Blaylock in The Hunger, Gary Oldman, who plays Dracula in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Antonio Banderas, who plays Armand in Interview with the Vampire. These are all typified by their striking clothes. And this is very unusual. I mean, what other monster in any culture is distinguished by its haircut or its dinner jacket? Why is this creature also, who is full of wild and dark energy, so predictably dressed? So my academic research is on horror. I work on Edgar Allan Poe, but I also work on fashion and dress history. And so I decided that for this paper, I was going to hunt down where these clothes came from, what do they mean, and why are they so important to the figure of the vampire? Now, a couple of extra points to make about the clothes here. And I'll just show you another picture here. This is Klaus Bang again. So first of all, these are some extra things to notice about the clothes. They are instantly identifiable as belonging to a certain type of creature and personality. So you just need to see these clothes, the black cape, the scarlet lining, and you know exactly what you're looking at. They also do not follow, or they tend not to follow anyways, accepted fashions. So the vampire costume never looks ordinary, like it just blends in to the everyday world. The clothes are often overdone and ornate. So they speak of excess, artifice, and extravagance. And in this sense, they pull against the features of the vampire that Weinstock outlines. They pull against the id-like formlessness, the pure vitality, the jouissance, the animalistic movement, technological change. All of those things seem to be pulled back by these very ornate and contrived costumes. And these costumes suggest things that are artificial, contrived. So when Bela Lugosi, here's this, when Bela Lugosi appears in the 1931 Dracula, he appears in a tux and tails, and the other men at the, I think it's they're at the opera. All of the other men there are dressed similarly, but his outfit is more, even in the black and white. He's got these extra medallions, the cloak is extra big, there's an excess to it. And also the scarlet linings of these cloaks are another sign of excess and elaborateness that prevent these costumes from occupying the ordinary realm of fashion. And these costumes also often have, in fact, I'm trying hard to think of one that don't have a whiff of the past about them. So Miriam Blaylock in The Hunger, for example, wears clothes that really are evocative of the 1940s and 1950s, not the modern clothes of 1983, even though at the start of the film, she appears in this scene, this nightclub scene of cutting edge modernity. She still seems to be a creature out of time. And Gary Oldman, I just rewatched Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, and the clothes that Gary Oldman is in, it's the 19th century, but he wears an 18th century jacket, things, or a coat rather, things like that. So he also is represented as being out of time. So there are these properties of the clothes here. They're instantly identifiable, they're static, they're contrived, they're ornate, they belong to the past rather than to the world of modern fashion. And these clothes also belong to the world of culture. They're not part of nature, like a sort of, you wouldn't associate a Lovecraft monster with its clothes, for example. Now, in fact, there is a name for this genre of clothes. Clothes that are not part of the realm of modern Western fashion, but are rather instantly identifiable as the garb of a certain personality, like the black cape, belong to the genre of visual typology, a genre whose association with garments developed in the 19th century. So what I concluded after studying these clothes is, and this is a work in progress, these conclusions are not by any means finalized, but my suspicion is that the vampire's clothes have all the properties of what in the 19th century became known as folk or traditional dress and was often called national dress. So in the 19th century in the West, national or ethnic dress became associated with a taxonomic partitioning and hierarchization of global populations and with the visual genre called typology. The idea here was that you could instantly tell what a person was, their whole history, their gender, their ancestry, their heritage, their morality and level of intelligence by looking at their clothes. Eurocentric Western fashions were thought to be the essence of modernity, change, and technological development. Folk or traditional dress, by contrast, was typified as ancient and primitive and was often associated with an inability or refusal of a culture to embrace modernity. So in what follows, I'm going to give a brief history of some of these ideas around folk dress in its Eurocentric understanding. I will then talk about how the vampire costume fits almost uncannily well into this framework. My argument is that the stubborn constancy of the vampire's dress should warn us against assuming that this figure is representative of some kind of wild, asocial, id-like fulfillment or embodies formless transnational energies. These clothes, in fact, I suggest, tether the vampire to a 19th century Eurocentric, intellectual, and visual architecture that is politically essentially retrograde and powerfully linked to 19th century gender and ethno-racial hierarchies. In the final section of the paper, I will turn to look briefly at Anna Lily Amirpour's vampire film, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which I think very cleverly recognizes the vampire cloak's origins and challenges its buried link to these regressive 19th century frameworks. The idea that populations across the globe could be identified through visual representations of their clothing is in fact a very old one that dates from the late medieval period. Maps and geographies containing pictorial representations of the people of the world, often called costume geographies or costume albums, circulated among global cosmopolitan centers, whether in Asia, Europe, or the Middle East, from about 1500 on. And this one here we see, this one was made in Japan in roughly 1600, and you can see all the little all the little people that cover the globe according to their costumes. But the late 18th and early 19th century saw a striking new chapter in the development of these costume catalogs, one that was enabled by changing ideas about how fashion and modernity worked. Metropolitan and cosmopolitan high fashion in virtually all previous centuries and parts of the globe had been partial to lavish fabrics, ornament, jewels, and cosmetics. And here we have an example of some typical courtly fashions in the 18th century. So in the case of Europe, outsized hoops, colorful satins, brocades, ruffles, wigs, and lace had characterized aristocratic and bourgeois fashion for both men and women from the 16th to the late 18th century. And these were thought to be straightforward indicators of wealth and station. So the wealthier you were, the more lavish the display on your body. But as fashion historians have long been aware, at the end of the 18th century, the fashions of Europe underwent dramatic and what would turn out to be permanent transformation. Fashions in the West, following the French Revolution, embraced a new minimalism. The ideal of clothes of metropolitan fashion were now unornamented, monochrome, and classical in inspiration. So the signature dress of metropolitan women from the 1790s until the 1820s was a long white sheath. And here is the portrait of Josephine, which shows this dress in its sort of quintessential form. The signature dress of men was the uniform still worn by Western men today, an early version of the business suit, long straight trousers, a jacket, a vest, a tie, all in bland colors. And here's some more. These are just I've taken from fashion plates of this period. This is sort of later in the 19th century. So women's dress would shortly reincorporate striking colors and patterns, but the transformation to monotone starkness in Western men's dress was so long lasting that in 1930, psychoanalyst and dress reformer John Flugel dubbed it the Great Masculine Renunciation. These minimalist clothes, moreover, had meanings. Purporting to be sleek and stripped down compared to their earlier counterparts, these new metropolitan clothes could be part of a narrative of Enlightenment modernity itself. They seem to tell the tale of subjects who had cast off the yoke of ancient oppression and had freed themselves of the signifiers of empire, wealth, and religion to enter a new world of liberty and equality. And so this is a very famous print of the new fashions meeting the old fashions in after the French Revolution, where you see the wigs and the huge petticoats of the pre-revolutionary era, and then the modern Republican dress of the post-revolutionary era. So in the discourses of the late 18th century, the subjects of modern fashion and revolution were figured by their clothes as divested of their ancient prejudices and alliances. And in fact, the metaphor of casting off clothes was central to the political rhetoric of both the American and French revolutions, where Americans announced their autonomy from Britain by renouncing imported British textiles and wearing homespun instead. And Paris revolutionaries earned the name sans culotte, or without culottes, without pants, for their inability to afford the satin knee breeches worn by aristocrats. So Western fashion thus articulated a new theory of fashion history or a fashion as history and teleology, proposing that newly unornamented Western clothes, and this is all relative because there was still ornament, had a peculiar ability to encapsulate and even enable modernity, carrying their wares toward a utopian future in which humanity's perfection will have been achieved. This new idea of Western dress as a bearer of futurity, however, had a corresponding negative doppelganger. The counterpart of modern fashion was a category of dress today called traditional or ethnic dress. That is, as modern fashion was created in this seemingly stripped down form, it created an allegedly exotic other. And this is where, in the Western ethnographic imagination, all the color, ornament, and volume of past fashions now came to reside. So it's really important to stress when looking at these materials that the clothes that were now made to play the role of ethnic or traditional dress did not start out with any prior relationship to Western dress or Western regimes. At the end of the 18th century, the various populations of the world dressed in whatever fashions or styles or habits were locally popular and meaningful to them. But the Eurocentric sartorial system that came into being in the West in the early 19th century forced these existing diverse fashions and traditions into a relationship with Western dress, ensuring that all dress could now be part of a uniform taxonomic and semiotic system. And because ethnic dress had an othered relationship to Western dress, it was now figured as the repository of everything that Western dress was not. Instead of being associated with modernity, enlightenment, revolution, sleekness, and change, ethnic dress came to represent qualities that modernity had left behind. It was something ancient, inherited, changeless, and often associated with rural and peripheral people. In addition, ethnic dress had a peculiar visual itinerary. In contrast to the bland, streamlined forms of metropolitan dress, ethnic dress was filled with wild color, peculiar patterns, oddly cut shapes, ornate ornamental trim, and dense embroidery. It was also now thought to be indicative of peoples who either rejected modernity or whom modernity had left behind. So here we have the most famous suit of ethnic dress consolidated in this period is the male Highland dress costume, immortalized for global audiences by Walter Scott in Waverley in 1814. I'm pretty sure that's funny. I'm blanking on the date of Waverley, and captured in a famous portrait of George IV, in which the king poses in garb designed by Scott himself and his associates. But the Highland dress was not alone. From the turn of the 19th century on, depictions of national, ethnic, and folk costumes, frequently rendered in meticulous ethnographic detail, were a staple of the thriving book and print markets of metropolitan and transatlantic Europe. And I've just gathered together a bunch of slides here. I'm going to show these to you. This is Costume of China. These are sort of typical costume of the Russian Empire. And the typical layout for these books was they were quite costly in this instance. And they would have a page that represented the type, the figure, and then a description of the population group. So these were part of a really costly set of books. The Swiss cantons were super popular as objects of observation. This is the costume of Norway, the costume of Portugal, and really by the 1830s, all of the globe had been encompassed in these ethnic dress depictions. Here we have Turkey, and here I've included a down market, like a children's book. They were very popular to teach children how to learn geography. So this is an upmarket and sort of children's book print. This is the same thing for Indigenous people. These are people of West Africa that were also depicted here. And this is some examples of some of the pages in these kinds of books. Now, one of the signal features of these clothes was that they functioned, as I said, in the genre of visual typology. Their signifiers claimed a naive stability that purported to allow the viewing subject immediate access to the wearer's culture and personality. Descriptions of ethnic dress from this period emphasize correspondences between ornate and colorful clothes and allegedly ancient and primitive cultures. In one book called Cosmorama, and one of the pages is depicted here, the reader is taken on a virtual tour of every inhabited region of the globe known to Europeans. Each region's population and clothing are described, as well as each nation's habits and abilities. For Aspen, color, ornamentation, and patterns in clothing feature as signs of the peripheral, unsophisticated status of its wearers. In Aspen's view, quote, only the higher classes of the English are advanced enough to observe great simplicity in their dress, end quote. And another quote, they are, quote, rarely distinguished for useless pomp or parade. end quote. In these works, the arcane detail and oddity of ethnic dress compared to metropolitan dress speak of an inability for the population to progress through temporal evolutionary stages to modernity. And this is also in the text of these books. So in one children's book, and this pictured here, Costume, Manners, and Peculiarities, English children are warned to, quote, stand clear of the Spaniard, whose opulent clothes indicate his savage temper, quote, with waving plumes and ample cloak. And I apologize for some of this stuff. It's very regressive. Some of it's respectful, some of it is racist. Who seldom smiles or cracks a joke, but hot and testy oft he draws his rapier for the slightest cause. In another children's book, The Little Traveler, we hear about the Dutch. Both men and women load themselves with an enormous quantity of clothes without taste or elegance. In another book called Costume of Turkey, the author highlights the arcane whimsy and even decadence of Turkey's urban water carriers. Quote, it is a singular thing that the business of a water carrier should afford a dress so ornamented. They wear a short jacket ornamented with gold or silk twist, red slippers, and a broad belt around their bodies, end quote. In Costume of China, we read several times about the cumbersomeness of the Chinese military. Quote, the general uniform of Chinese troops is cumbrous and inconvenient. The general dress of the soldiery is almost suffocating, being lined and quilted. And these uniforms, not surprisingly, are indicative of what this author believes is the character of the army, which is, quote, very ill-disciplined. The soldiers are ignorant of military tactics and they lack personal courage. Now, before I move on to discuss vampire films, it is worth noting that these costumes and taxonomies were not unrelated to the pseudoscientific race taxonomies that also proliferated in this period. The exact relationship between this new idea of ethnic dress and the theories of race science, pseudoscience, that typically focused on the biological body, developed as overlapping and interchangeable systems in this period. And this is really worth emphasizing. On the one hand, of course, clothing seems to belong to a different epistemological realm than flesh. Clothing can be changed and removed, yet the Western fashion sign system was less concerned with materiality than with legibility. Race pseudoscience, modern Western fashion, and the culture of ethnic clothing propose to read the truth of the subject in the visible surfaces of the body. Like the flesh and bone subjects of race pseudoscience, the subjects of fashion and the ethnic dress system presented themselves in this theory as legible surfaces in which a knowing viewer detected ancestral and inherited character. Whether the legible surface was flesh or clothing did not make much of a difference, especially, of course, because the whole thing was a fiction and viewers basically saw what they wanted to see. But these correspondences are made evident. So here is a map, or it's a standards and costumes hierarchy of the world's populations that was produced in the United States in the 1850s. Here we can see that clothing is utilized here in the development of this hierarchy. And in fact, these costume geographies and albums would announce this in their pages. And one of them, in Costume of the Russian Empire, we hear, quote, dress is no less a striking distinction of nations than customs, language, and bodily configuration. So in this particular chart, the hierarchy moves from those dressed in Western metropolitan dress at the top to increasingly colorful and ornate dress towards the bottom. It's also interesting to note how frequently clothing appears in racial taxonomies later in this period. This is a separate line of research, and I haven't really dedicated much time to it here, but by the end of the 19th century, ethnic clothes were so closely associated with racial identities that they became central to white nationalist and Germanic supremacist politics in Europe and the United States. So it became a sign of your racial purity if you dressed in the, quote, alleged folk garb of your Germanic ancestors. And I should also note that by the start of the 20th century, this obsession with the signifying power of clothing had reached far beyond the West and was a global phenomenon. So any countries or regions that participated in World's fairs or expositions had to devise a look for themselves, and national costumes and folk costumes emerged as a major part of this presentation. Now, does the vampire costume conform to the norms outlined in this typological system? I would say yes. First, vampire clothes, like these ethnic or folk clothes, are ornate and contrived. The red satin lining of the vampire cloak references this ornateness. Vampire clothes typically form a distinctive contrast to a simpler Western fashion, whatever that fashion happens to be at any given moment when the film is made. Moreover, like ethnic clothes, vampire clothes always appear as things that belong to the distant past. As in costume geographies, which believe that clothes allow viewers to see a people's relative modernity and levels of development, vampire clothes always bear the marks of this peculiar temporality. They look old-fashioned or out of step with modernity. And it's interesting to note that there actually was a moment when this black cape with its scarlet lining was considered the cutting edge of modern fashion. It was in 1820. In the 1920s, so 100 years later, when these cloaks were popularized on stage and in film, they would have been seen as old-fashioned. So this sense that they belong to the past, moreover, is emphasized every time the costume gets recapitulated in a new vampire film, because it can gesture to previous iterations of the genre, performing a kind of meta-commentary on its own origins in a seemingly ancient history of vampire images. So the more these images get used, the more they seem to belong to an arcane past. Finally, and this is important for the next part of my argument, these typological clothes occupy the realm of what semioticians call the sign. Writing in 1957 on the recently released US film Julius Caesar, Roland Barthes famously noted the production's striking reliance on a few articles of hair and wardrobe to convey the vast complexity, history, and power of Rome. All of the male actors in Julius Caesar, from stars down to extras, are given a short little fringe of hair at the top of their foreheads, right? This little, and Barthes says of this fringe of hair, what then is associated with these insistent fringes? Quite simply, the label of Romanness. We therefore see here the mainspring of the spectacle, the sign, operating in the open. The frontal lock overwhelms one with evidence. No one can doubt that he is in ancient Rome, and this certainly is permanent. The actors speak, act, torment themselves, debate questions of universal import without losing, thanks to this little flag displayed on their foreheads, any of their historical plausibility. Their general representativeness can even expand in complete safety across the ocean and the centuries and merge into the Yankee mugs of Hollywood extras, no matter. Everyone is reassured, installed in the quiet certainty of a universe without duplicity, where Romans are Romans, thanks to that most legible of signs, hair on the forehead. In other words, these few simple articles like the fringe of hair are offered in Julius Caesar and other spectacles, not as literal objects, but as, quote, a sign, a curiously compact visual device that seems to compress all complexity into one semiotic node. Now, the culture of ethnic dress is filled with these signs, whether the wooden shoes of Holland, the dirndl of Austria and Germany, the Highland dress of Scotland, the Western US cowboy hat, the war bonnet of Plains Indigenous people, the kimono of Japan, and on it goes. All of these objects have this kind of iconic power. So as soon as we see them, we're intended to understand what they mean. And the vampire costume, I'm suggesting, belongs to the same category of objects. It has at its source a 19th century typological apparatus which theorized the simplicity of the visual field and the utter correspondence of the appearance of the body and the moral and intellectual abilities of the person and their population group. One needs only to look at these articles of clothing to understand the totality of their wearers and of the world they inhabit. Now, it's worth emphasizing that Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was published in 1897, and which is generally taken to cement and launch the vampire genre in its modern form, was published in a decade, the 1890s, when folk and ethnic dress, which had been immensely popular in the early part of the 19th century, were enjoying a significant revival in Europe and globally. Ethnic dress would remain popular until the Second World War. And of course, right-wing and white nationalist political culture in Europe was associated with the fetishization of seemingly ancestral folk costumes, which were understood to embody a group's racial supremacy. Interestingly, in the 1890s and early years of the 19th century, Romania and regions of Transylvania where Stoker's Dracula takes place became central players in the folk dress fad. And here are some costumes of Romania that are from the second half of the 19th century. So in fact, one of the signal proponents of traditional dress among leaders in Europe was the Queen of Romania, Elizabeth of Wied, who was queen from 1869 to 1881, and who she had these very elaborate and costly costumes made for her that signaled her affinity with the local culture. The tradition was carried on by her successors when she was Romania's crown princess, Marie of Edinburgh. Later, Queen Marie of Romania also began wearing peasant-inspired clothing from the country's eastern provinces. And interestingly, these tropes of dress actually appear in Dracula itself. The novel does not have anything at all to say about Dracula's clothes beyond saying that he wears nothing but black. And at one point, he steals Jonathan Harker's clothes, presumably as a disguise to help ferry him to England. Nor does the novel have anything to say about the clothes of any of the other characters. However, the opening pages of the novel are full of passages describing the traditional dress of the people of Eastern Europe, principally Romania. So as Jonathan Harker travels to visit Castle Dracula, he finds himself, quote, just on the borders of three states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe, end quote. Instead of describing the landscape, Stoker spends many paragraphs describing the dress of the local populations. Quote, the women had all full white sleeves of some kind or other, and most of them had big belts with a lot of strips of some fluttering from them, like the dresses in a ballet, but of course there were petticoats under them. And the next quote, the strangest figures we saw were the Slovaks, who were more barbarian than the rest, with their big cowboy hats, great baggy, dirty white trousers, white linen shirts, and enormous heavy leather belts, nearly a foot wide, all studded over with brass nails. They wore high boots with their trousers tucked into them and had long black hair and heavy black mustaches. They are very picturesque, but do not look prepossessing. On the stage, they would be set down at once as some old Oriental band of brigands. They are, however, I'm told, very harmless and rather wanting in natural self-assertion. The next quote, I was evidently expected, for when I got near the door, and this is Jonathan again, I got near the door, I faced a cheery-looking elderly woman in the usual peasant dress, white undergarment with a long double apron front and back of colored stuff fitting almost too tight for modesty. When I came close, she bowed and said, the Herr Englishman, now and again, and that's it for that quote. And then the next one, now and again, we passed a lighter wagon, the ordinary peasant's cart with its long snake-like vertebrae, calculated to suit the inequalities of the road. On this were sure to be seated quite a group of homecoming peasants, the Czechs with their white and the Slovaks with their colored sheepskins, the latter carrying lance fashion, their long staves with axe at the end. So there is literally no further mention of clothes in this novel, but for 19th century readers, these opening descriptions of folk dress would immediately have set a scene, transporting Western audiences to a picturesque space that by definition belongs to a world that modernity has left behind. As in costume geographies, moreover, these scenes of Eastern European folk dress invite us into a system of very simplistic typological signs with their vistas of evolutionary and teleological time and what many scholars call the Orientalization of Eastern Europe in the late 19th century. Moreover, these ethnic clothes were clearly so central to the meaning and identity of the novel Dracula that they were reiterated in the early film versions of the novel. So here are some scenes of peasant dress. Now, my screenshots are just not great here because it was hard to get them. But you can see here this is from Nosferatu, Murnau's 1922 Nosferatu, which centrally features folk dress at the start of the film. Okay, that's from Nosferatu as well. Todd Browning's 1931 Dracula likewise features these folk sartorial motifs. And that's another one from Dracula. Werner Herzog's remake of Nosferatu in 1979, in addition to emphasizing folk dress, also emphasizes its metropolitan opposite. And when I rewatched the film from the point of view of this research, I was very struck by this image. Herzog's film opens with shots of Lucy and Jonathan Harker, and here they're made into a couple, wearing the signature metropolitan clothes of the early 19th century, a dark suit for him and a pale dress for her, looking out over a wide open horizon as if to the teleological potential of futurity itself. The shots of Jonathan Harker among the peasants, which then appear subsequently in the film, play against this earlier scene, emphasizing that Jonathan is not moving forward, that he has foolishly chosen to return to a dark, superstitious past that will reach forward and infect the present. And the vampire's dress in these films is true to these historicist motifs. Sorry, this is all just, this is in Herzog's Nosferatu. And here again, these ornate outfits are emphasized. So the vampire's costume here is of a piece with this theme. In here with Count Orlok, it looks vaguely like a priestly cassock, but it's definitely not a modern dress. So the vampire's dress then, as it developed in the first part of the 20th century, had this sort of invisible architecture of Western historicality and its attendant ethnic, racial, and gender baggage. And the fact that the vampire's costume is so easily reiterated means that the vampire film itself as long as it draws on the frameworks of 19th century visual topology, and its costuming of the vampire also relies on a fairly conservative teleological and invisibly ethno-racialist ideological apparatus. So every time we're presented with the sexual wildness, the id-like amorphousness, and unlocatable strangeness of vampires, we're also pulled back via their costumes to a regressive set of underlying truisms about distinctions between Western and non-Western cultures, between the Western metropole and its Orientalized others, between the ancient past and the modern present, and also to any gendered baggage that might come with this architecture. So it is this invisible architecture in which history and character are written on the visible surfaces of the body that vampire films compulsively recapitulate when they imagine the vampire in a specific replicable costume. Now, it's precisely this feature of the vampire costume, its continuity with what the West defines as traditional dress, that Anna Lily Amirpour's 2014 film, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, hits upon and fully reveals and highlights. Amirpour's film is about a fictional, seemingly Iranian place called Bad City, where a female vampire stalks the streets and preys on abusive and irresponsible men, urging them to be good boys. Shot in black and white, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night shows us a bleak and horrifying world filled with pitch dark alleys, a horizon choked with churning oil pumps, and streets where bodies are rotting in open trenches. The male characters in the film, with the exception of the protagonist, Arash, are drug dealers or drug addicts who mistreat, abuse, and kill women, family, and animals. The vampire, meanwhile, is a girl who preys on these men. She is clearly a kind of avenging angel figure who metes out justice to the representatives of immoral and corrupt patriarchal order. The most striking feature of this film, however, is its costume choices. As we might expect, the vampire, known only as the girl, wears what seems to be the standard black cape of the vampire, but it's actually not a vampire's cape. Instead, she wears a chador, the long black veil worn by Muslim women in traditional Iranian society. And here's the poster from the film and a picture of the girl, and she's only known as the girl. Now, the veil worn by women in many Islamic countries is a classic example, today probably the most glaring example, of a piece of typological clothing that has outsized meaning and presence in the Western imagination. A token of the West's Islamophobia, the veil today is the ultimate Orientalized garment, allegedly signifying the stark outside of a supposedly benign Western liberal democracy. Of course, the veil also continues to function in many Islamic cultures, not as a mythical sign of a Eurocentric otherness, but as a powerful instrument and symbol of women's obedience to patriarchal rule under Islam. And of course, like all articles of clothing, it can also just be nothing. It can just be itself, something you grab and put over your shoulders when you're going out. However, by cleverly exploiting the striking visual similarity between the vampire cloak and a chador, Amirpour's film reveals the hidden ideological architecture of both objects. Most importantly, for my purposes here, the vampire cloak is revealed as a kind of Orientalist structure inside Western fantasy that takes visual form. Our shock and pleasure at seeing the cloak and chador as interchangeable objects comes from our sudden understanding of the vampire cloak's attachment to a long history of clothing meant to represent the other. By making these two sartorial objects interchangeable, the film both reveals the vampire cloak's hidden architecture, and it also radically undermines the stability of both sartorial objects, of both of these sartorial objects, as they flicker back and forth in a way that challenges the certitude that's so central to the functioning of the typological genre. And I just have a couple more pages here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the film. We can see this instability early in the film. The very first time we see the girl, who is played by Sheila Vand, She appears as a sinister, ghostly figure shrouded in a black veil, who stands behind a car where a pimp is abusing a prostitute. Viewers are here in a position to believe that she's a monitory figure, an embodiment of state-sanctioned Iranian womanhood, outraged at the exploitation of women in a society that purports to keep them sheltered from masculine sexuality and aggression. It is only afterwards, when she kills the pimp by first biting off his finger and then draining his blood, imitating the actions of the prostitute, that we realize that the girl is a vampire. The costume, in other words, plays an uncanny double role, flickering back and forth between two typological figures, the submissive veiled woman and the devouring vampire. The film then goes on to exploit the uncanniness and instability created by this confusion of two otherwise rigid signs. It's worth noting that under most circumstances, vampire films cannot really comment on the vampire's dress, partly because this dress is offered as part of a world in which the vampire's essential personality is conveyed in its appearance. The whole point of a typical appearance for the vampire is that it relays a specific notion of stability around bodily surface and characterological content. But in Amirpour's film, the interchangeability of the vampire costume and the shadow radically undermoors the relationship between surface and subject. Is the girl in her black a feature of Iranian patriarchy, something that attacks it from within, as we might expect of a figure wearing the veil, or is she something from outside Iranian society, as her many Western interests and affectations suggest? Now, the film as a whole is obsessed with sartorial imagery, and the implication is that the film sees the garbling and confusion of clothing in the typological system as liberating, a vertiginous queering of the typological scene. So, for example, the film opens with a typological image, a shot that's Sheila Band, a shot of the protagonist, Arash, played by Arash Morandi, wearing a kind of James Dean getup, a white t-shirt, tight jeans, sunglasses, and pointed boots. Immediately, this figure conveys a certain kind of 1950s American masculinity. But no sooner has the film established this figure than it cuts to a trans person who appears at various points in the film as a sort of David Lynch style motif, asserting the instability of the gender typological landscape at which the costumes seem to gesture. This destabilizing of gender through dress and cosmetics then becomes central to the arcs of the two protagonists, Arash and the girl. Changes of clothes for them act as a kind of doorway to alternative subjectivities and ways of being. We see this in a rudimentary way with the vampire girl, who frequently changes into a sort of drab Western clothes. But the most important transformative sartorial doorways in this film are created around the vampire cloak itself. In one of the most memorable scenes in the film, Arash, the James Dean character, or type, attends a masquerade party where he hopes to sell drugs. He has been forced to sell drugs to support himself and his father, who is a heroin addict and who is in a sense the real vampire in the film. Arash decides to dress up like Dracula. The party is a disaster for him. The woman he has a crush on rejects him and he ends up taking bad drugs. But after the party, wandering around stoned and lost in a strange part of the city in the dead of night, he runs into the vampire herself, the girl whom at this point we only know as the dangerous predatory creature who feeds on men. They face each other in a moment of strange mirroring in which the black cape pretend vampire and the shadow-clad real vampire meet in a kind of uncanny symmetry. The mirroring and confusion of these black capes destabilizes the typological visual array, producing a symbolic warp or radically shifted alternative social space, what Lacan might call a new intersubjective module, which then acts as a doorway through which both Arash and the vampire girl can step. And this is the moment at which their romance begins. The film ends with both characters rejecting the stories that should go with their costumes in the typological scene. Arash rejects conventional masculinity and the guarding of the patriarchal heritage represented by his father, The vampire in her veil rejects both her symbolic role in state-mandated womanhood and her legacy as a predator. They decide instead on roots created through the transgression of established sartorial histories and meanings. They end up taking off on the open road together with their cat, fleeing Bad City for the unknown wilds of romantic love. In other words, the film explores the hidden architecture of vampire dress and its power as a sign in order to reimagine subjectivities under patriarchy, whether in the Muslim world or in the US. In this talk, then, I have looked briefly at the history of the vampire costume as it developed in Western theater, film, and television in the 20th and 21st centuries. I noted that while the vampire is associated with wild and uncontrollable energies, with sex and danger, jouissance and pure id, depictions of vampires tend to replicate a set of sartorial features that have remained bizarrely changeless since the early 20th century. I have argued that this changelessness is not a trivial feature of the vampire, but rather reveals this figure's hidden debt to a 19th century fixation with visual topology as a historiographic and taxonomic tool. We looked at 19th century figures of folk and ethnic dress and looked at the extent to which the vampire costume was linked to this bygone sartorial symbol system in which the appearance of the body and the character of the subject are presumed to be indelibly linked in changeless and static correspondence. Finally, I turned to look at Anna Lily Amarpour's film, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, to see an example of a film that exploits and deconstructs the Orientalist architecture of the vampire costume and ultimately imagines novel opportunities for subjects who remain tethered to the logic of the visual type. And I'll just very quickly, I'm finished, but I will share, this is my book, Fashion Nation. It's just come out. And it deals with, it's mostly focused on the United States, but it deals with these topics. And this is my, in my university information, if anyone wants to get in touch with me. And I think that's where I stopped sharing.
Thank you.
And what time is it? I lost. I lost.
Oh,
okay. An hour.
We don't have a schedule here.
Okay.
We start on time, but we have no end time. So, I guess to your last point, the quote from Dracula that comes to mind from Harker's diary is, "One gets the impression of leaving the West and entering the East."
No. And Dracula, I mean, you know, scholars have long understood that Dracula is wrapped up in this late 19th century Orientalist world, and that it's, you know, and Jeffrey Weinstock talks about this in his book. And there are actually 7. I think he has 7 major qualities of the vampire film, but these were the 3 main ones. So I don't think that, I'm not sure it reveals anything new about the vampire, but I think it does reveal something interesting about the way this figure can be reiterated. I guess, you know, through all these different formations, in ways that I'm not sure the authors are conscious of. Like, I'm not sure, like, the costume designers, I mean, why the attraction to that one outfit, for example? It's sort of interesting. I myself am attracted to it. So it's sort of strange. Like, I like, you know, when you see the repetition of a form, it gives you pleasure in a way. Like, that's part of why people keep returning to it as a touchstone. But it also is, you know, very wrapped up in these ancient, you know, these kind of things that we no longer think of as relevant.
I have a couple ideas here for you.
Yeah, please.
Kevin Wetmore talked a little bit about it, but I'm going to make a jump that he didn't make. You know, Dracula is in the universal line of horror, right? 1931. Yeah. But I think we'd be mistaken to remove 1925 Phantom of the Opera, Lon Chaney, because the opera cloak in the Phantom of the Opera is not dissimilar from the vampire cape.
Yeah. And well, it's actually that I didn't think of that. That's a really good observation.
I just thought of it tonight while you were talking.
No, I know. Well, once you start going down this road, like you do start thinking of all these things. A lot of these costumes actually had their liveliest moments on the stage. The drawings were brought to life on the stage. It's not clear that actual people wore these things in all cases. Like, it's not, they occupy a very funny sort of space that is, they're not part of everyday clothing. They're not really part of fashion history. They're not really part of local culture. They're really fantasy objects right from the beginning. And so that, it doesn't surprise me at all. And I think also that the early 20th century, it had a new power to visualize these Gothic motifs, I guess.
Right.
And things that got filmed were subsequently ossified, either as, they came to exist as parody, or they, limits the limitations of the wardrobe on film sets, like, what, oh God, we have to do Dracula, what are we going to put him in? Here's this cape kind of thing. So yeah, it's really interesting. It's an interesting question.
I think, but because if you think 22 Murnau, right? Warlock is not wearing the cape, as you so clearly, and I'll return to that.
Mm-hmm.
But again, 25, we have Lon Chaney in the cape as the Phantom of the Opera, and they're not different stories. The 31 version of Dracula is not altogether a different story from the Lon Chaney version of the Phantom of the Opera, which both have. The Lon Chaney version of Phantom of the Opera is slightly close to the book. The ending is certainly not. But the Browning Dracula, really far away from the text, and it's based on the play that is you pointed out too. And of course we have the Spanish one being shot simultaneously using the same sets and costumes. So I think there might just be an iteration here of this idea, this Americanization of horror in relationship to the Phantom of the Opera, I guess it was French, but
I didn't think about that. That's really interesting. But no, because the Dracula, the guy who does it on stage, the first cloak guy, is British. Yeah,
but there's the popularity of that movie can't be overstated.
No, it can't. No. No.
And so I think that ubiquity of it as being this grand tradition of cinema, because also was at the time the most expensive movie ever made, the Phantom of the Opera.
That's a good point. I'll go back and look at that. I think that, so you're thinking that Dracula is actually echoing the Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah, because what's the inversion scene? The only scene they do in color where they hand paint the slides is when he's wearing the Mask of the Red Death costume, which again, I think fits your thesis quite well.
Yeah. And, I left out, there were also drawings of Dracula that had him in the 1920s, that had him in these black capes. It makes sense with the wing, like with the bat wing. It sort of seems to echo with the bat. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, it just makes sense that this character would appear in this kind of in this kind of garb. I guess what's more surprising is that it was so often redone in the same way.
You were talking about the descriptions of Dracula, and I got a couple of theories here too for you.
Yeah.
The whole thing. I got a couple of theories.
Yeah, that's very fun. Yeah.
There is another description of Dracula's clothing where he is actually wearing a cape. When he climbs out of the window, as Harker says, lizard fashion, his cape goes over his head, giving him the appearance of having bat wings.
That's true. Yeah.
So there is a cape.
There is a cape.
We just don't know what kind of cape.
No. No, that's true. Yes. And in fact, the early, the editions of the London Draculas had, I had those in my slideshow, actually. I took them out because it was all too long. But depicted him in a sort of batwing cape in the 1920s. Yeah, for sure.
It's also strange to me, Klinger in his annotation, because it is a striking scene when Dracula steals Harker's clothes. This is a very striking scene.
And is it in any of the movies?
No.
Yeah. That's a strange thing too. Here you have a wonderful episode in the novel that is never.
There's so many.
Yeah, but
Dracula has an amazing late speech, because if you actually read the book of Dracula, you only hear Dracula speak authentically through a letter once. That's the only actual voice of Dracula you ever get, is the one letter.
Yeah.
But then you have Harker recording him in the first quarter. And then you never hear his voice again until very late, when he gives this threat, when he's just like, your women are my jackals, which will bring you to me.
Yeah.
But here's some thoughts on all this. When he steals, Klinger's theory is, and I don't buy the theory, because we don't see it. It's not borne out. But the theory here is that Dracula is stealing Harker's clothes, not just to implicate Harker in all of his crimes, like stealing children, which we know Dracula's doing. And of course, that peasant woman mistakes Harker for Dracula, right? You monster. Where Harker all of a sudden speaks Romanian. But Klinger feels that he might be getting clothing made based on stealing.
Well, I thought he stole them. Like when I read the novel, I think that he doesn't have any of his own. He doesn't have any modern Western clothes.
Now, the reason it doesn't work is when Jonathan sees him later in London and faints, he's still dressed all in black.
Yeah.
And then the key scene for me goes back to that speech I just mentioned, when Harker slices at him with his Bowie knife. He's in the Nosferatu clothes. He's clearly this almost anti-Semitic Orientalist figure that Nosferatu puts forward, because gold pours out of him. He bleeds gold.
Yeah, and the whole anti-Semitic thing is really interesting too, because I was rewatching Herzog's film for this, and I had just heard Dragon's talk, who spoke in this series, where he talked about Herzog's film as being a contemplation of Nazism and Germany, and he seems to put Dracula in a kind of black leather Nazi getup, which not sure that fits with my argument.
Well, for Dragon, I mean, the 79 Herzog, he's Hitler, like the vampire.
Yeah. Or some,
well,
the
idea
really
of
ugly, some really ugly spirit. And it's interesting too, the way the whole film, actually, I rewatched it last night after rewatching it a couple of times for this paper, and I hadn't actually cottoned on to these things, but the opening too, with the cadavers, with that you realize who they are through their shoes and things, like it's the clothing stuff is very prominent in it. But I believe that Herzog is playing with the same figurative structures that I'm referencing here, but maybe twisting them up a little bit. So I would that's a whole other paper and how I want to teach that film.
It's a great one. We showed it actually on
so
Halloween.
Good. What?
We showed the Herzog on Halloween after.
Did you? Oh, yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. No, it's so good.
I'm trying to figure out where I want to go next here. The other theory I wanted to pose to you about the actual text of Bram Stoker's Dracula, of why we get so much well, there's two theories I want to pose to you, of why we get so much description from Harker's diary at the beginning and then no clothing afterwards. I have two theories here. The one is quite simple. The original quarter of the book was a short story called Dracula's Guest. it may just be isolated because of that.
Mhm. Mhm.
The other theory I have here too is Jonathan Harker is super classist.
Yeah. Yeah. No, well, I think that they're supposed to, but I really think that it's supposed to take you into this. And it was what World's Fairs proposed to do. They proposed to transport you to another world, right? You were
Sure.
supposed to enter into these kind of virtual realities or the places that were virtualized for you, these exotic sort of domains. And I think that that's what's happening there. And you might be right that it's the artifact of a short story. I don't know. It seemed.
Well, I have evidence. I'll give you my evidence.
Okay, sure.
Quincy Morris is never described as wearing like a cowboy hat or something. He is a Texan,
Yeah.
but he's described through semantics. He's described
That's
through using
right.
slang, but not his dress. He's not
That's
in
right.
boots. He's not in a cowboy hat.
That's
we
right.
don't know what he wears.
Yeah. Yeah. But in the films, he's often overdressed.
Oh yeah, I mean, like in the 92, his hat gets sat on, right? Seward sits on his hat.
Yeah. No. He's often got a funny vest on or something.
Yeah, it's like leopard print or something. But
Yeah.
I mean, in the book, he's so weird. He's like, I mean,
Yeah.
he's been on a ship in Korea. He's been to the Marquesas. I mean,
Yeah.
all these places.
Yeah.
So you almost
Teddy
expect him to be like
Roosevelt.
Ben Franklin at the French court, just like
Yeah.
putting layers and layers of stuff on.
Yeah. It's funny. Yeah. I don't know. Anyways, it's all very interesting. It's all very interesting to contemplate. It sort of opens the door. Like this is clearly, this is at the very beginning of my contemplation of these things. And I hadn't, it just didn't occur to me till I started writing this. I thought, And when I reopened Dracula, and I was like, oh my God, I have a gift. Like this is a gift because I hadn't remembered those passages in it, and
Well, the other thing is Jonathan is obsessed with getting the recipes. That's the other weird thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like he wants the eggplant recipe, he wants the roast chicken recipe.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I don't know, like a town and country article is how it kind of
it's true. Well, he's like a tourist. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah.
And that's the souvenirs he's bringing back for Mina is recipe card.
Yeah, that's the intended one.
Yeah.
The actual one is a little more threatening.
A bit. I want to go back in time a little bit with some of the stuff you were talking about.
Sure.
Because there's a really cool book I think it's an article chapter in a book. Either way, I can send it to you actually because I have it on this computer next to me.
Sure.
Norman Bryson wrote a chapter article called Jericho and Masculinity.
Uh-huh.
And it's about the wearing of the Napoleonic uniform.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about this idea in 1803 to 1815 of having to like rise to a level of masculinity to adorn yourself with all the accoutrement of Napoleonism that I think is quite fascinating and fits into your thesis pretty well.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too to think that military uniforms were an instrument of modernization in the Ottoman Empire too. Like the military uniform was kind of considered the cutting edge of a sort of anonymous equality. Like you could all be the same in these uniforms. Yeah, and they feature as well. They're part of depictions of the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution as well. And that's right. They were. I'll read that. That sounds. Yeah. How do you spell that? BRYS.
BRYSON.
Okay. Cool. Yeah.
Actually, if you just remind me, I'll send it to you because I have it on my computer.
Okay. For sure.
I know I have a PDF of that. That was my advisor in grad school, actually. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the other book you might enjoy is she's a Harvard professor. Her name is Iwalaja Burkhardt, and she wrote a book called Necklines.
Oh.
And I think you would appreciate this because I have another
Okay.
theory here that might
Mhm.
play really well into it.
Yeah, go on.
You probably see where this is already going.
Yeah, I do.
Well, part of the reason that you see the high collar rise up in France post-revolution is if I don't have a neck, you can't chop it off. You can't.
Well, actually, what happened in the post-revolution, women chopped off their hair. It was actually the opposite thing happened. They chopped off their hair and they fetishized the neck as a kind of, it was a sort of, I don't even know what to call it, like a suicidal impulse to.
Well, yeah, they had the bows de victime. They wore the guillotine earrings.
Exactly, to be next to the death or something. And the short hair, the chokers too. Red chokers were in style as a sign of that you were next.
Yeah, well, they did they had the White Terror in 1797 where they walked around. I mean, that's why they had the sticks, right? The sticks are to beat poor people to death with. Like that's actually the point of the walking stick. It's funny the clothes that it's funny the burdens that clothes come with in the 19th century, like 18th century novels. I work on American literature, so I actually don't work on a ton of British literature, but my sense of 18th century literature is that mostly the characters are not described in terms of their clothing. But when you get to Walter Scott, there's pages and pages and pages devoted to these regional, this regional dress. Ivanhoe opens with, just 7 pages of nothing but descriptions of clothing. So there's this real, in the early 19th century, there's this real obsession and fetishization of dress as a kind of a repository of, or if you can access the clothes, you can access the people in some way, and which makes its way, and which is part of that period's anthropology and ethnography too. No, I mean, it's really fascinating. I mean, also, just the French Revolution itself, right? 89 to 94, like just the idea that wearing the wrong clothes can get you killed.
I know.
Because Robespierre wears a white wig throughout the revolution.
Yeah.
He's the only one.
Yeah. Right.
There's so many wonderful Robespierre stories too.
Yeah.
You pointed to the a la grecque style, which I'm quite a fan of women in the directoire. Because this is you alluded to the incroyable fashion which that's coming from. It is interesting because that also picks up into Dracula, right? That's what the female brides are usually shown as wearing, is very a la grecque style, for that the same sort of like sense of titillation around the body.
That's true. I didn't. Do you have any particular, I'm just, and now the only thing that's in my head is the Coppola one, where they're sort of dressed in kind of Orientalist.
Well, that's because the fashion designer was a kabuki theater designer too.
Right. Yeah, and it looks at or the fashions are very theatrical in that film, but. I
feel like the original, or the Bela Lugosi, I should say. I feel like they're in these white dresses.
Yeah. I guess. Yeah,
I mean, they're not. The décolletage is not as low, but that's the prudishness of America in 1930.
Yeah, I guess they're in there. Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that they. Well, it's all they all invoke this kind of historicity, or this kind of depth of time. That these figures seem to come out of, and old-fashioned clothes is one of those ways.
I mean, it's Madame Recamier, right, who popularizes this, right? Because David fails to paint a portrait of her, and then Gerard paints one, and then, of course, comically in the 30s, Salvador Dali paints them in a coffin. Which you could make a lot out of that too in terms of Dracula if you wanted. But this fashion style is actually, for its simplicity, is the height of aristocracy at this time period too, which is another thing we
Yes.
associate with vampirism is
Yes.
aristocracy.
Yes. And it becomes those markers. There's a whole other project here on how these markers of excess become associated with a class inferiority too, right? Like it's not just like, an old aristocracy or excessively ornate, a bygone time, but they also become part of, like a class disparagement, like in a Dickens novel, right? The middle or the sort of cheesy evil characters are always overdressed in the United States too. That's also the case. Yeah. And it becomes, that sort of minimalism becomes a sign over and over again, becomes a sign of modernity and of being cutting edge and of taking off your clothes. The fewer clothes you have, the more modern you are, sort of.
I want to stick on this like Beau Brummel high neckline just for a second.
Okay,
because
sure.
There's a fetish in England, and I'm blanking on the year that The Importance of Being Earnest was written, but
1880 something, 80.
Yeah, I know it's close to Dracula. Of course, Dracula's Stoker's wife used to date Oscar Wilde.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
There's a little link up there. But Lady Bracknell is obsessed with the French Revolution in that play. She gives her giant speech, which it concludes about the worst excesses of the French Revolution is the line.
It's been a while since I've read it, but go on.
It's the handbag speech, and she's blasting Jack for having been born in a handbag.
Right. Yeah.
That's how she ends. She's like, it reminds one of the worst excesses of the French Revolution. So, and even if you fast forward to today, Downton Abbey, there's a line that Sybil, I think, says, where she's like, Granny hears the rattling of the guillotine when anyone talks about class distinction. So, there is a British obsession 100 years on with the French Revolution. And so it is fascinating if you think about guillotines and vampire bites, which I hadn't thought about till tonight as well.
Huh. No, I hadn't thought about that at all since you just said it just now.
Yeah. And then I think about, the same thing we're talking about, like with Dracula wearing the red medallion and things too.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. And the neck that's really interesting actually, because the neck is always the site of fetishization in vampire films, but that's of course not the only place on the human body.
Well, they also chop their heads off too, right?
Yeah.
Like that's how you kill a vampire.
Yes. Yeah. That's
I'm like I said, I'm just coming up with this on the spot.
And that's very true. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's that link up with this like late Victorian fetish of the French Revolution chopping the head off and the vampire, because the other thing Dracula is he's continental European.
Yeah, and he represents, in a lot of Gothic fiction, the evil person is this artifact of an ancient arcane civilization, whatever, that is past, often associated with Catholicism or and with parts of Europe where the Enlightenment has not hit yet, or whatever. Or that's the interpretation of the writers of the stuff, anyways. So yeah, that's actually really interesting. I wonder if there's anything about that.
I don't know.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
If not, my name is Matthew Jarvis.
It's like the entrance of the modern folk.
And I wonder just how long that lasts. How does it last into the Edwardian period? Does it last? How long into English history does that obsession last too?
With the beheading till Game of Thrones.
Which is funny because the British did it 100 years prior with Charles I, so it's weird that they're so struck by class in that way, right?
Yeah.
One of the other funny descriptions of clothes in Dracula I wrote down was Jonathan gives a long description of the underwear that the driver is wearing, the coach driver to the Borgo Pass, taking up the full window with his underwear.
Well, but that's interesting actually, because of course that's Dracula driving, right?
No, it's the one taking.
The coach driver.
Yeah, he says it takes up the whole window. His underwear.
Yeah.
Because he sexualizes in the weirdest, almost scatological ways, like women's breasts and the clothing, men's butts and the clothing.
No, I don't think I didn't note that for some reason. I'll go back and look at that though.
I'm teaching a class on the novel right now. So
are you?
So intimately. I'm not normally this intimately close to a text.
I was thinking, that's you exactly have the kind.
You were like, this guy knows Dracula really well.
And of course you do if you're teaching something. Yeah.
The last point I want to kind of make in relationship to all this too is we went into parody. You left out one of my favorites, of course, Dracula Dead and Loving It.
Which I haven't seen. I haven't seen that one.
Okay. You also, in The Fearless Vampire Killers, the Polanski, when he descends into the room, he's wearing the red cape as well. Yeah,
I didn't get a chance to rewatch that. There was a whole bunch. I just, there's so many of them. I had to sort of pick and choose ones that I thought would be sort of relevant. But
worries.
I can.
There's only 230 versions of Dracula on film.
I know. That's right. There's just there's so many, and then all the vampire films. Like it's not just there's just hundreds. But one thing I was aware of, like rewatching Twilight. That's not my favorite movie. And I was not happy to be rewatching it, but that's life.
You watch the BBC one, you can watch anything.
Yeah. Oh yeah. What did you think of that?
Oh God. I have never felt something drive so hard off of a cliff by episode 2 in my entire life.
It was very strange. Because it had all the ingredients to be great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. It might have been Dragon who said somebody said the scene on the ship was actually really interesting.
Yeah. I thought that there was things to be redeemed in it, but it was trying very hard to be current.
Well, yeah, Steve Moffat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. But one of the interesting things about watching these films was how we were as an audience member anyways, I was cued to miss the costume if it wasn't there. And I was, because you go into a vampire film in most cases knowing it's a vampire film, you have an expectation of what clothes are going to look like, and the costume designers and the production designers in the films obviously play with that. So that's sort of that was very interesting. But you were very aware of the fact that these were non-conformist vampire figures in lots of the movies, so that was cool.
It is interesting to see, and I want to say this, then I want to move into the 92 because I'm working on the 92, so I'm always willing to talk about the 92 Coppola. But a note here I made was that the what is the legacy of the vampire cape in terms of the absurd places it goes? And I mean, the most absurd place it goes is in Plan 9 from Outer Space in 1959. Where Lugosi dies during filming and Ed Wood's dentist dons the cape and walks around like this the entire time.
That is the functioning of Bart's the sign, right?
Yeah.
You just need this little cape and the whole story is before you, So
because he was buried in it. Bela Lugosi was buried in his vampire cape, which... Take that for what you
terrible fate for an actor, really.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, why was it still so ubiquitous? And then I recalled, in 57, Shock on TV released all the Universal movies.
Yeah.
Into syndication.
Yeah.
And so it was
And they
actually
were
2 years
real.
prior, and that's
Yeah.
why we still had it in terms of like culture. And I just don't think,
Yeah.
I think
I think
wonder
that you're right. I think that the reiteration of the media and which generation of people are watching what is really important. Yeah.
So I wonder, like, in the 40s, like the late 40s to the mid 50s, does the cape vanish? I don't know.
I don't know. I guess it survives through Bela Lugosi in a way. Like, I think that figure becomes so iconic that, it has a sort of life of its own. And then, then it can just be revivified.
Yeah, I want to see
made into its own undead.
Robert Mafe had a chart or something. I want to see like I want to see the chart of vampires in this cape, I guess.
It's funny because when I was rewatching Herzog, even though Count Orlok is wearing a sort of Nazi leather coat, at one point in the film, he is sort of flying across the town with his cape. The coat becomes a cape. So he's flying across. So
well, too, he becomes Lord Voldemort, right? Like there's a pretty clear through line between Voldemort and Orlok.
That's interesting. Anyways, what were you going to say about the 1992 one?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating movie in so many different ways. I mean, it's it is a costume movie. Like,
totally.
In the 90s tradition of costume fetish British drama.
Yeah.
So I mean, it is fascinating because you get the weird. I mean, as I said, it was Ishiko who did the costume design and the set design. Actually,
you're fabulous.
She went all out in terms of like the dragon kimono robes that he wears around his house and stuff. Then picked up an Interview with a Vampire, as you sort of.
I don't know though. Weren't they kind of made around the same time? I was
3 years later.
Yeah, but they would they have been filming? Like, I don't know if that would have been possible because films take so long to make. I'm not sure whether they would have been able to, but they didn't need to copy each other for the language to be out there. So it's sort of interesting. Yeah. But the costumes in that are just phenomenal. Like they're just, it's just spectacular. And they really, the film really sort of gets at the heart of this kind of decadence too, that is part of the 1890s, and as as sort of part of the surround of the novel, I guess. It's sort of like Crimson Peak or something. There's just a lot of tropes and they're all put to use. But if you love the genre, those things, I love watching those kinds of things. So
I guess Farshid brought up the Lucy's wedding dress, right? That was supposed to make her look like a lizard.
I thought it made her look like a mime. I thought she looked like a mime.
It's some sort of like it's like the scene in Jurassic Park when the spitter lizard, because then she does the exorcist thing in her grave, right? She gets up blood all over of people.
Yeah, well, that's very guillotine too. They're guillotine.
Well, it's a disc around her.
Exactly.
Head.
Yeah, no, it makes her look. So John the Baptist. It makes her look like her head's on a plate already. Yeah. And it's, as far as I know, it's completely inaccurate. Like, I don't think that, I mean, the film doesn't make any, it doesn't aim for accuracy, but I'm pretty sure that would not have been a wedding dress at that period.
No. And it's almost Elizabethan, right? It
very much is. It very much is. Then with her sort of reddish hair. That's a good point. Yeah.
I mean, that's always how because she's got the makeup on almost as thick as Elizabeth would have worn it herself.
And the white makeup, the undead.
Hopefully not lead in this case.
No, hopefully not.
The thing about, with Lucy is that I think it's striking is that the weird sisters, the brides, whatever you want to call the three women in Dracula's castle, right? They're in white and Lucy is in red undergarments always.
Yeah.
And Farshid said something really interesting last night that I actually hadn't thought of, is Lucy equaling Lucifer in this regard. And linking her to redness in this way.
Yeah, she really is. Yeah, all of her surroundings are red.
Well, she also wears a snake dress, if you recall. It's
Yeah.
very much a throwaway line. She's
Yeah.
meeting with all the men. She's like tempting them and telling them to look at her snake dress. So
yeah, that's another kind of that seems to be another sort of 1890s like snake woman reference.
Yeah.
You know, the sort of Lamia kind of.
I was thinking Stux the Sin.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, you could write a whole thing about these costumes in these movies completely separately.
Yeah,
they're really because they're very well thought out.
I want to thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been delightful.
My absolute pleasure.
Yeah, and you know. Well, I guess the talks are finished now, but
we had a comment for you. I just saw it. I'm sorry. Somebody asked me to say, please ask her about her book. So I guess they want to know more about your book.
Oh yeah, it's called Fashion Nation, and it is about how the quality of Americanness was pictured in the international scene in the United States. So as I said, I work on American literature, and I look at, like, I do the first chapter is a lot of this sort of folk dress stuff, and I look at how these folk types were developed for Americans, and how travelers represented Americans, and how Americans represented themselves, and how there was a lot of arguments, transatlantic arguments between the United States and Britain. And I sort of look at that. And finally, the final chapter is on World's Fair culture, and how nations were trying to materialize themselves, not just in clothes, but also in these 3D architectural edifices. So I just sort of trace that. I trace that history, and it's got beautiful images in it that are color. I'm very proud of the beauty of the book, in addition to its argument. And it's full of fascinating little strange things that most people who read in the 19th century United States are not aware of. So
when's it coming out?
It's out. It just came out in September. Yeah, and you can get it on. I don't know. Should I share a screen again?
If you'd like.
Maybe you.
It's out. You can get it. Who's it through?
It's University of Michigan Press, but you can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it anywhere. It's called Fashion Nation, and my name is Sandra Tomc, and my name's on the
So go buy your copies of Fashion
Go buy
Nation.
your copy, definitely. Yes. And I actually have another article that will be coming out in the journal Dress that's on how these audacious clothes were adopted by white nationalist and nativist figures in the 19th century United States. So that's kind of interesting too.
So again, I want to thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, good night.
I hope that answered Roger's question. I want to thank everybody for being with us this year. I really appreciate it. Stay tuned for more out of us. You can follow us at Spooky Evening, singular, on Twitter and Instagram. You can find us at Spooky Evenings, plural, on Facebook. You can find us at spookyevenings.com to follow us on other places as well. I want to invite you for the final time to take the survey that Juan is dropping into the chats. And until we meet again, stay spooky. Thank you so much.
Okay. So it was very fun. It was very fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. There's so much to think about. Now I'm like obsessed with this idea of the the
Well, you're an
guillotine
art
blade.
historian, are you not? Are you an art history professor?
My area right now is art history.
Yes, I thought when I read your, so I thought, oh, because this is really art history territory.
What is?
Well, the costume albums and costume geographies.
Oh, sure.
There's very little written on them, but what is written on them is mostly by art historians.
Well, it's funny because my dissertation was on half of it was on Jean-Baptiste Bailly's portrait that Girodet did, and I get into his costume in microscopic detail in relationship.
Oh, because your knowledge about that was very deep and dense, so that explains it.
I do happen to know a lot about the costumes of the turn of the century from the 18th and 19th century, just from writing that. And also, actually, the funny thing is Napoleon in portraiture gets whiter and whiter as he conquers more of Northern Europe.
Does he really?
Yeah, culminating in the 1806 portrait by Ingres, Napoleon Enthroned, where he's got these two marble orbs on his throne, and his flesh is the same color as the orbs.
Interesting.
Well,
But it's a different
Zeus
series
too, right?
Yeah. Would the artists have been talking to each other, or would they have seen each other's work? They probably would have.
Yeah, I mean, he was in the studio of David, so they would have. I mean, it was all shown at the Salon too. Napoleon hated the painting. It's at the École Militaire